The category is What the Trans, darling?
Hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans?
What the Trans, indeed. Ashley, I went to a second-hand bookshop this week, right?
Ooh.
And I walked in, and they had a cafeteria area. Because bookshops, independent bookshops have to have that, otherwise they go out of business. And I got like 4 books for £6. And
Nice.
they're all good books. And I just forced this into the podcast like I have. For no other reason than to say, people, you don't need to give money to Amazon. There's places called bookshops and they sell books for like nothing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the second-hand ones. There's a couple of good ones up here as well, rather. So other than
I may never buy. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, other than advanced bibliomancy, what have you been up to this week?
Oh, well, that's basically been the highlight of my week. Although I do have some really good news and a thank you to people about something I haven't really said about the podcast, really.
Ooh.
So what happened was a member of our team, Alex, did like a journalism course
Yes.
at his local college institution of some kind. And I was like, I've only been doing journalism stuff for like coming up 8 years. Maybe I could try and get one of them. So I did a crowdfunder thing because I've got like not a lot of money. And it was like 1,500 quid to do like it properly.
Yes.
And I got like half of it within a few days.
Nice.
And I've purchased like the first modules you need to do. So I'm studying journalism at home in my pajamas now.
Cool.
Thanks to people who may well be listening. So if you donated to my crowdfunder, thank you. That's really cool of you. And now I have books.
Yeah. Can't argue with that.
Yeah, this might be slightly related to my rant about how cool bookshops are.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I did wonder about that. If there had been an inciting incident.
Yeah, the cool thing about the course is, like with the first module at least, which is like the basics, it's like essentials of journalism. I already know 70% of it because I've been doing it.
Yeah.
Like, I've been going through the different blocks, and it's like, oh, I did that for episode 43. Oh, I did that for episode 67. Oh, I know about that. And it's like, well, the trans has been part of my journalism schooling. So thank you for teaching me, audience and Ashley, how to do this.
No problem. Glad to have helped? ?
Yeah, it's been a cool ride. But anyway, enough about me. How are you doing?
Yes, I am all right. I've been at home. I've got my fancy chair now. I think I mentioned that on the last.
You did. How are you finding it? Are you winning races?
I am absolutely winning races, yes. I'm probably not going to win any races against people who are, sprinting, but I absolutely can outspeed most people walking. So the thing that I've noticed is that there's mostly kind of 2 people, walking around on the street in Manchester, particularly in the area of Manchester that I live, fall into 2 categories. Either they will trip over themselves to fall out of the way, to get out of the way rather, to, sort of say, oh no, please, you first kind of thing. And then the other type is people who have got no real awareness of what's going on around them and will sometimes walk straight into the chair because they're looking at their phones, and it's like, that's a bit, dude, come on, you could easily have avoided that if you just, looked up every 10 seconds or so,
You gotta look up.
Hell, even every 15 would have done, So yes, that's a bit annoying. But I live in a slightly studenty area when or at least we're near the universities themselves. So this behaviour is absolutely not unique to students. Because it happens in the centre of town if I go in the other direction as well, so, But yes, the chair has been tremendous. People said to me before I got it, it'll give you a whole new lease of life and it's going to change your life, and I was like, I'm not sure it'll do that, but I was wrong and they were right, because it absolutely has. I can now just go out and run errands. Oh, we need some milk. I'll go, because I can. And, I need to just go out and drop this prescription off or pick a prescription up, kind of thing. And, oh yeah, I can do that myself now. I don't need somebody to come with me and push, sort of thing. So, I mean, again, if you were part of the many, many people who donated to the crowdfunder that I had running for that, I can't thank you enough, honestly, because it genuinely has. It's such a cliche to say it, but it has changed my life, because my life over the last year has been a lot of sitting inside and getting really annoyed. And now I can get really annoyed outside as well. So that's good. Also, yesterday, as we record this, it's been a year since I was told, look, it's probably MS. Yeah, a whole year.
That is a year.
Yeah.
That is a fucking year.
It was quite the time. Yes. Because, I was stuck in my house and then I was stuck outside the house for a month each, and I was in hospital for a month, and all that stuff about last year that we covered in the 2022 Can Go Fuck Itself episode. But I'm still just like, bloody hell, as if it's sometimes it seems like it's been decades or centuries, and sometimes it feels like, bloody hell, that was only last week, and it wasn't. It was literally 52 weeks ago. So anyway,
time flies when you receive life-changing news.
Sadly, yes.
But I like that we've started this as a kind of practicing gratitude, because in different ways our audience have improved our lives.
Yes, in genuine, tangible ways that we can even put a number on. And that's just so astonishing and humbling, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It kind of, for me, it kind of puts a bit of pressure on me to
yes,
get the thing done.
Yeah, I do feel the same, but then perhaps...
But yours doesn't have a grade. It's like you haven't bought the wheelchair and it's like, right, in 12 to 18 months you have to take an exam on wheelchairs.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
Like, you don't have, like, they knew that they were giving you money so you could go to the shops. And
just
you
do
go
stuff.
to the shops is you doing that.
Yeah.
Like, you're under pressure to use it outside of the world. That's your job.
Yes. Anyway, let's crack on, shall we?
Oh yeah, we've got a podcast to
Yes,
do.
indeed we do.
So we've got, for fuck's sake, it's the news.
Oh, not the news. Ugh.
Got to do some news, good and bad.
Yeah.
That is one way to describe it this week. So as people who have been listening to the podcast for any amount of time will know, those who oppose seemingly any transgender rights advancement, no matter how tiny and inert that advancement is, they are met with the claim that this would endanger cisgender women. The danger has never been that defined, but over the last few years there has been more of a focus amongst mainly conservative politicians and right-wing media outlets that the danger is sexual predators. You allow trans people to do a thing, predators. Trans people think predators. That seems to be where it's at.
Yeah, that's the level of discourse, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. It's absolutely fine to, think, oh, a lot of people I love are probably going to read that, like, I'm the devil. Fine. But yeah, consider this your content warning for this section of the news. It gets pretty weird. So, last month, the UK government, as we covered last time, blocked Scotland's gender recognition bill from becoming law after the Scottish Parliament overwhelmingly passed the bill. The bill would have removed the medical diagnosis requirement for a gender recognition certificate, lowered the quote-unquote lived experience requirement from 2 years to 3 months, or 6 months if you are under 18, and lowered the minimum age to 16. So you people 16 plus could get one. That's basically it. It would not have changed the Equality Act. It would not have changed anything about anything else, like prisons, for example. Cut to every media outlet and most Scottish Conservatives talking endlessly about trans people in prisons for the last 2 fucking weeks. Isla Bryson is a Scottish trans woman who was convicted on 2 counts of rape late last month, who was placed in a women's prison whilst awaiting sentencing. Considering the trans issues were already in the news, you can predict what happened next. Endless stories about how Isla Bryson represents everything wrong with the GRR bill, even though the GRR bill had nothing to do with prisons. And also the fact that the GRR bill wasn't a law because it was blocked by the same people saying it's related.
Yes.
How could a bill that wasn't passed affect something like this? It doesn't make any fucking sense, but I'm just getting started, alright?
Yeah.
This has really wound me the fuck up. So, to add more to the absurdity of the situation, the Scottish Prison Service guidelines which have been in place since 2014, and seemingly have never been much of an issue in the way they were placing trans people before, these have been under incredible scrutiny, despite the fact that they have operated on a case-by-case risk assess model when determining where to place transgender prisoners. The Scottish Prison Service has, as a result of the media shitstorm around this, they have ordered an urgent review of all trans prisoners in the women's estate, no matter what crime they have committed. So the case of Isla Bryson, I have no idea about, apart from what she was convicted of. Is she safe? Is she dangerous? Where should she go? Is she trans? Isn't she trans? I don't know. I am not someone who has done a risk assessment on Isla Bryson, nor has anyone else outside of the Scottish Prison Service. But the media storm around her has sparked a wider debate about where to place any trans person in the prison system, resulting in around 100 web articles that I saw and roughly counted, a ton of TV coverage, and thousands of arguments online. So how big of an issue is trans people in Scottish prisons? How many trans people are there in those prisons right now?
Go on.
15. There are 15.
Right.
Which shakes out to 0.24% of the entire Scottish prison population. There is something like maybe as many as 10 news articles and media reports per prisoner. Yeah!
Yeah.
But the scale of the issue doesn't appear to be the point. Having already tasted blood with the blocking of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, the case of Isla Bryson came along at just the right time for those looking to take chunks out of the Scottish National Party, and Nicola Sturgeon specifically. But it also resulted in some of the most revolting media coverage I have ever seen during this moral panic, and that's saying something. Trans people have been conflated with sex offenders and rapists on the basis of one case, and that is something we have seen before, but not at this scale. Like, this is arguably worse than the whole Karen White thing from like 4 billion years ago.
Yeah, such innocent times.
It's like Scotland is going through what England and Wales went through in 2018. It's really bizarre. But yeah, it has been truly grim. Many of you will be aware of what I'm talking about. If you aren't, just Google trans prisons and you can ruin your day for yourself.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing that came from this is what the UK government did next. On the 26th of January, roughly 10 days after the story of Isla Bryson broke, Justice Secretary, Deputy Prime Minister, and proto-fascist with no neck, Dominic Raab, announced that trans women with quote-unquote male genitalia... Don't know why I said it like that. That was a bit Matt Berry, but let's go with it.
Yeah.
Will be banned from women's prisons no matter what crime they are convicted of, whilst any trans woman convicted of a sexual offence, male genitalia or not, will also be banned. He did announce that exemptions will happen, but for only truly exceptional cases. No more detail was released.
Yeah, nothing else given.
So 2023 is clearly off to a bad start for trans people. What do you think?
Yeah. Difficult to dispute the assessment there. It's not the bestest start to a year, I suppose. I mean, are we surprised? No, but it's still just... I mean, I would say disappointed, but then that would indicate I ever had some expectations for the Tories in the first place, which I didn't. But this is just more... It's more of the same from them, isn't it? They're just stoking a culture war, and we're the collateral damage that they don't care about. You know, I'm not sure if any of them truly believe the things that they're saying about trans people. But as you say, 15 trans people on the, in the prison estate in Scotland, 0.24% of the population. And there's all this fuss, all of this screaming and shouting over almost nothing. I mean, yes, there's some horrible, nasty people in the trans community. There are in any community, particularly in the Tory party, actually. Because if you're looking to keep your children safe, you need to keep them away from Tories and priests, frankly.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's an astonishing number of Tory MPs that have been accused of impropriety. I think that's the legally safe term for it.
Allegedly.
Allegedly impropriety.
But yes, there are quite a few of those alleged incidents. It's the projection thing again, though, isn't it? You know, it's like when TERF/RADFEMs talk about institutional capture, and they're worried that, or they pretend to be worried that certain institutions, you know, arms of government and BBC and whatever, have been captured. You can hear the air quotes clanging into place around that word, by trans people, when actually the opposite is true. They've been captured by the gender critical ideology, and they're spouting that ideology, and it's putting us in danger. So, yeah, just it's kind of more of the same, isn't it? It's so disappointing, as you know, and this is leaving aside for a moment the whole concept of prisons and their necessity, which is a whole other conversation for a different episode. But yeah, hooray!
There is one silver lining that might not be a silver lining. I don't know what it is. It's definitely not good. But when it comes to England and Wales and Dominic Raab banning trans women with a willy, not the most mature way I could have put that sentence together, but I'm going for it. That's kind of how it works now. Like, it's not the protocol, but in practice, because most trans women, and this has been a thing that's been true for years, like, trans women in prison has been a story that I've been covering since my Pink News days. Like, one of my first big stories was about a trans woman in a men's prison. Yeah. In the vast majority of cases, trans women end up in a men's prison, and in those prisons, they suffer horrifically. They suffer a higher rates of sexual assault than almost anybody else in the prison system, trans women specifically, in the men's estate. That's just the facts. That's Ministry of Justice numbers right there.
Yep.
And so there's part of this, you could take this as showboating, because he's saying, oh, we're going to ban all the trans women with quote-unquote male genitalia, with only a few exceptions. That's basically how it works now. It's just formalized. So there is a path that specifically doesn't really change much, but the problem is that the situation is really bad for trans prisoners. And I hope that we can all agree at the very least that, like, wherever you stand on prisons and whether they're a good idea or not, at the very least, you'd want prisoners to be treated like people. Arguably, prisons can't treat people like people.
Yes.
I'm a bit of a prison abolitionist, but I'm trying to, like, put my shit aside to, like, report to a wide church of opinion in our community on prisons, because the opinion is diverse. It's not easy, but I'm trying. Yeah, I think at the very least, you'd want prisoners to not be treated like shit and sexually assaulted a lot, right? That even, like, right-wing people would want that, I'd hope.
You'd hope. Yeah,
I might be being naive about some people on the harder right. But yeah, but when it comes to Scotland and stuff, it's just so strange how this is playing out. Gender Recognition Act reform in England and Wales between, like, 2016 and 2018, and then Karen White. Yeah. This, and then Isla Bryson, who is probably going to become just as well known.
Yeah, she'll be the example of the bad trans person that, you know, people who call themselves feminists will constantly parrot back at any trans person, usually the ones that are out protesting, trying to make change. They will just immediately be deluged with pictures and facts about her and demanding a response, essentially demanding the time that it takes to debunk what they're saying, only for them to completely dismiss it and say, well, no, you're wrong, because this is what I believe, and that's what matters.
This all sort of came to a weird head the other night on Question Time.
Oh, God,
Last week, by the time you listened to this, India Willoughby was on. There was somebody from Spiked. I feel it's important to point out, India Willoughby, she's done some pretty racist things. She's been really shitty about non-binary people in the past. Not the biggest fan of what she has done publicly. Having said that, I don't really think there's many trans people who deserved what happened to her on Question Time. She was just faced with so much hate that I think would have happened no matter what trans person was sat there, to be honest. I think that was probably all an inevitable thing, considering how the BBC is. But yeah. It's getting ugly out there. It really is in that respect. Like, when I say out there, I mean in the public discourse, that place which, oh god, it kind of sucks. So, people listening, watch nice things. I've been watching The Last of Us, and I love it. That's actually a happier show than the news at the moment. So yeah, go find something to watch that's nice, and don't think about this all the time, because your brain deserves nice treats.
Indeed, but you don't come here to the podcast, to our podcast specifically, to hear about nice things. And unfortunately, the next story is not a particularly cheerful one either, since it revolves around nobody's favourite bewigged sex pest Donald sodding Trump. Now, when the American people decided he was more trouble than he was worth and elected somebody else, I honestly hoped that would be the last we'd hear from him, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't be. So now Trump has officially announced his intention to run for president once again in 2024, and his first order of business is going to be to destroy the trans community. No other way of saying it. In a video released on February 1st on his own platform Truth Social, irony there.
Oh my god, I hate this man. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, same. Well, he made a number of worrying promises over actions he would take if he's to be re-elected. Now, it's tempting to say that is a big if, but it was the last time too, and he still got in, so I'm reticent to completely dismiss him here. Without going into too much detail, he said he'll get rid of any transition-related healthcare services, seemingly for trans people of all ages, but with the usual think of the children focus. This would include any federally funded programs that, quote, promote the concept of sex and gender transition at any age. Ah, I see you've spotted the word promote in there. Well done. Why, yes, that is the same word that Vladimir Putin uses to suppress anything that's even slightly LGBT-friendly. What a strange coincidence to find it used here, too. Now, throughout this announcement, Trump used anti-trans talking points like they were going out of fashion. He wasn't even bothering to use dog whistles anymore, he's just coming right out and saying stuff like he'll not only get rid of any kind of support or treatment for trans youth, but he'll also criminalise anyone who tries to provide that support. He also said that his government would investigate big pharma and hospital networks to establish if they, quote, deliberately covered up long-term side effects of sex transitions in order to get rich, end quote. Which is just... I mean, obviously it's factually inaccurate, as was most of this statement. No one is performing any transition-related surgeries on children, but he is out there saying he will legislate against it anyway. He's not really the sort of chap who lets facts get in his way. Now, hearteningly, the backlash to these comments has itself been quite swift, so GLAAD, the American LGBTQ group, has said that Trump's statement indicates increasing desperation in another failing campaign, and I really do hope that they're correct on that last part. Others have described the tirade as completely unhinged and terrifying, which personally is a bit difficult to disagree with, but several commenters have pointed out that at this point he can still be resisted and hopefully stopped in his tracks. Writer Caitlin Burns pointed out, yes, it's completely unhinged, but we need to fight back instead of arguing on Twitter about it, and went on to say we should fight back very hard and very soon. We don't have time to wait years to do this. So while this is absolutely a disgusting and deeply worrying statement from Trump, it is not a certainty. He has a long way to go before any of this becomes actual law. So, what are your thoughts there, Michelle?
I mean, what do you think my thoughts are? You think I'm going to say Trump is right?
I kind of figured that we'd be largely on the same page, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I was kind of expecting this, and I think most people probably were expecting this at some point because the anti-drag, anti-trans hysteria in the States has reached fever pitch. Like, their moral panic over this started a bit later than ours, but it is making up for lost time. It used to be that trans people in red states would regularly tell me online that, like, they wouldn't come to the UK because they don't feel safe. And I was like, wow, look at your governor. Like, you're already there. I couldn't believe it. But now, I mean, anyone who are, like, you shouldn't really rank these things, but I mean, it's pretty clear Rishi Sunak was interviewed by Piers Morgan recently and did a bunch of dog whistles and a bunch of transphobic nonsense, including bragging about blocking the gender recognition bill in Scotland, by the way. Bragging. But yeah, he's not calling for banning healthcare. Like, that's a thing he's not doing. It doesn't seem to be a thing that most people in the Conservative Party are doing. The Republican Party are straight up saying, like, well, not straight up, indirectly saying that this is a plot, that trans people are a plot by Big Pharma, which is a phrase usually means Jewish people.
Yes.
Like, it's usually Jewish people are making people trans. And when ages ago there was, well, not that long ago, actually, about 6 months ago now, wow, there was a mass shooting where the shooter released like a 200, 300-page manifesto online. And people online were saying, oh, it's mostly about trans people. And I was like, well, I guess I got to read that manifesto then. Love what I do. And I did. And it turned out we were half a page. But that half a page was the Jewish medical industrial complex is making people trans to destroy the traditional family. Like, we were a bit part in his weird logic to hate Jewish people. And so when I hear somebody saying that, like, oh, Big Pharma are coming to make people trans and make money, there's a thing there, right? I'm not just imagining that. Like, there's a thing there.
Yeah, they're
an anti-Semitic thing.
Yeah, I think so, because it's the same. I thought the anti-Semitic canard was globalists.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure I've heard him ranting against that as well. So it is, it's not even a dog whistle anymore. It's just a whistle.
The thing that people don't talk about that much, and I've got to give credit to a man called Adam Todd Brown for this, because he was a writer at Cracked, the humour website.
Yeah.
And in 2015, he spelled out Trump.
Right.
And everyone thought he was a joke for doing it. Everyone thought that Trump was a joke. Everyone thought Adam Todd Brown was out of his mind. But he said, Trump's going to win because of a bunch of people who feel like they've been abandoned, and he speaks to them. And also, he's actually a Nazi.
Yes.
Like, he has one of Hitler's books in his bedside table, which was true.
Right.
Hitler, and seems to be somebody that Donald Trump at one point was very interested in.
Right.
And yeah, so in that context, none of this surprises me. It's capitalizing on the rising anti-queer sentiment in the States. He is just doing what British politicians and media outlets have been doing for 7 years. Transphobia is about profit and advancing yourself. That's what it is. It's always been that. There's always a reason and a gain the transphobe receives from doing transphobia. And the gain here is obvious. He's looked at Fox News and is like, right, I'm going to jump on this. And it's so cynical and evil, basically. That's my take. I'm done talking. I don't know what else I could say on it.
Well, I think you're pretty bang on, honestly. As you say, this is something that he can use to rile up his base, the people who are going to vote for him already, and pull a few more people in. People who otherwise might have voted Democrat, but, are TERFs / gender critical. So, and some of these people, it's like you kind of want to ask them, what do you think he'll do if he wipes all of us out? Do you think he'll stop there? Or do you think he'll move on to the next group? It's just...
That's the thing. In the States, and not arguably, probably definitely here, these anti-trans ideas are either directly coming from or boosted by cis men. Like, all of the newspaper editors and media outlet people who run media outlets tend to be men in the UK. And in the States, it's much more foreseeable. It's much easier to see it that way. Whereas in the UK, they platform cis women in transphobic groups a whole bunch. In the States, that isn't nearly as much. It's like they've taken the language of these fucking clowns in like GC movements, and they've made that Republican talking points. But it's coming from men, mostly in the States. And here's the kicker with all of this, right? You've got all these anti-trans bills going across the southern states, like banning healthcare for kids, banning drag, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Even, like, if Trump doesn't win, America's going through something that is terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, there are trans people fleeing states right now for their own safety. This is like the early stages of something pretty weird.
Yeah.
By weird, I mean bad.
I was going to say, like, could you clarify the specific usage of the word weird there? Because you're absolutely right, I think.
Yeah, I don't like to go down that thing because, I'm doing the journalism thing. I'm trying to be all like, well, maybe we should maybes and maybe it's this way too, and trying to think of all of the angles. But it's hard to argue at this point. And Trump can win.
Indeed.
Like, he has tremendous support amongst a whole bunch of people who didn't just die last election. There is a chance he could win. There's a chance that anybody who stands an election can win. It's entirely possible. If they're in the race, they could win. Having said that, there is a massive response. Like, American equality networks are so much larger and have so much more money than ours do. So, I mean, Caleb Burns is right. Like, there is a fight that can be won here. And I'm optimistic that they can, but these threats are real. So try not to leave this segment completely disillusioned because, America, they have a track record in both directions, spotty sometimes, but they also have a track record of kind of winning sometimes. You know what I mean? Yeah,
sometimes the stars align and they do the right thing.
Well, they let gay people marry.
Eventually.
Who saw that coming?
Yeah, after, being more or less forced to do it tooth and nail. But yes, you are right.
Yeah, that came starting from the grassroots all the way up to, equality lawyers and stuff at places like Lambda Legal and Human Rights Campaign and all these other groups that have money. And they just hammer the Supreme Court for years, and it worked.
Yes, indeed.
And I can imagine that those groups and orgs are going to step up again. But yeah, we should do another newsy bit.
Yes, indeed, we probably should.
Do we have one that's not in the kind of depressing
genre?
Let
me see. Okay, no, not that one. No, not that one. Not that one. Just give me a minute. Not that one. Aha! There it is. So to wrap up the news with a little palate cleanser, we now travel to Finland. Not literally, of course, but through the magic of describing events and reactions using this new thing called words. Earlier this week, Finland's parliament passed a new law on gender recognition, which abolishes the need to prove that the trans person is infertile in order to be recognised in the required gender. Which is pretty fantastic news. Many countries around the world unfortunately still have the requirement for a trans person to prove they are unable to have children before they can be recognised as the correct gender. So Finland overturning this requirement shows that while in some places things are sliding backwards, in other places we're still pushing forward with progressive reforms. And Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin openly describes herself as coming from a rainbow family as she grew up with two mums. She's previously said that she was very keen to get this particular legislation through, as trans rights are very important to her, which is also pretty fantastic, as is the fact that the bill was voted through 113 votes to 69. Nice.
Yeah!
Woo!
Way!
Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Finland is now magically the land of milk and honey for trans people. There is still quite a lot more work to be done, but for now, just for today, it's nice to have a bit of a win.
Yeah. And, it's nice that we are reminded every now and again that progress is being made slowly, at times painfully, at times terrifyingly, but progress is being made in all sorts of places like that. Spain last year did a similar thing.
Yeah.
And overall trans lives in those countries will be made quite a little bit easier. Like a bit easier, and that's not nothing. We're a recognised minority group all over the world. 50 years ago, that wasn't even a thing. 50 years ago, as you will hear about in our meet very shortly, it wasn't even a thing. There was just lots of trans people around who thought they were the only ones. And now this.
The times, they do change. And,
not being made sterile by the state to get recognised as a person, that's when I put it that way.
Yeah, it sounds weird when you put it that way.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? There's the obvious reason why that's a thing. Kind of like we need to stop trans people breeding, stop more trans people.
I see.
which doesn't make much sense because there isn't that much evidence to suggest that trans people is something that runs in families. But there's no other reason to have that except like a eugenics thing, right? Because I've looked for a thing just to be like, right, that's what it sounds like. But there might be an intention I don't know about. Maybe there is some other reasoning that exists, some bullshit nonsense reasoning, but reasoning that people are doing. It's like, no, that's literally it. That's why it exists. So they got rid of it.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Trans people can go off and make tiny baby things with their genetic matter.
Indeed. Yeah, so that was some good news. And I thought that would be, quite good to hear about the creation of a completely new and different and helpful gender recognition law.
Yeah, there has been some good news. Like, there was the thing with The Sims 4. They just released an update with, like, binders and more non-binary friendly options and more trans-friendly options for making your Sims.
Yeah.
I don't want this to be an advert for The Sims. I don't really like adverts. And, the people that make that game have been controversial to say the least over the years. But you know what? That's just nice, because lots of people play The Sims.
Yeah.
Which probably means a lot of trans people play The Sims, because, as Abigail Thorne recently pointed out, it engages in the fantasy that, our generation can buy a house.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
So it's a very popular game. So that's a pretty cool thing. Also, there's a non-binary person who's going to be on like a Marvel show, Ironheart.
Nice.
So yeah, they're going to be like, in front of, well, at least me, because I watch all that Marvel stuff obsessively. And yeah, so there is good out there. Just right now, like, we're doing this news bit, it felt really weird to not talk about the prison thing, because that's big policy that it affects a lot of people. And the Trump thing is a thing that is potentially affects millions of trans people.
Quite.
So it felt weird to not look at those, but also there is some stuff going on. There is some advancements out there that are maybe not getting as much attention because they're surrounded by these big, fat, scary things.
Yeah, I wonder if that's kind of part of the strategy, just take up all of the space in the newspaper or whatever, so that nobody else, and specifically no trans people, get to use any of it.
Yeah, and I'm now training to do that.
Delicately put, as ever.
I will, as I go through this course thing, I will definitely raise points on the podcast where I think, this is how this happens. This is how. This is what they're teaching. But yeah, should we broil some meat?
Ooh, delicious meat. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, for people who don't know, we have a big bit at the second half of the pod, which is the meat. So this is what that section is. We've never been good at introducing the two sections of the podcast.
Not massively.
But,
I've been working on my segues recently, but they're not all a winner, sadly.
So yeah, on this me, I sat down with Roz Kaveney. Now, Roz Kaveney is a writer. She's a critic. She's a media analysing person. There's a proper term for that. It didn't come to my brain. So that's what she is now. She's also been an activist all across a bunch of different struggles over the years, and I kept running into Roz at protests, and every time I thought, why haven't we had her on before? And I didn't get a good answer from my brain. So I was like, at the last one when I ran into her, I was just like, Roz, can we have like an hour with you? And she was like, absolutely. Turned into 90 minutes of unedited interview because I genuinely stopped looking at the clock because the chat was really fascinating. Like, we go over her life from where she was born and where she grew up and hanging out on the streets of Manchester with trans people in like the 60s. Something that you don't hear about a lot. Her time in the queer movement with Gay Liberation Front, and then working with Liberty, and right up there to working on the Gender Recognition Act and the Equality Act in parliamentary forums. Like, she's done everything. And that's not even touching on her literary career, which includes working with all sorts of people, like Neil Gaiman and people like that. Like, she's really good friends with Neil Gaiman, it turns out. And yeah, she's had this incredible life. So, and I didn't want to talk to her because it was LGBT History Month. Mostly because I didn't know it was LGBT History Month till the day before we sat down.
Right.
But it's kind of kismet that, like, Roz was there for a lot of key shit. So yeah, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, let's play the tape.
Yeah, here's Roz herself.
Well, I always used to date everything back to when I was 13, 14 and realizing, oh my God, there's this thing. Only comparatively recently, I discovered that actually it went back much earlier and I'd suppressed the memories of my childhood because the woman who was my best friend in infant school got in touch with me. And I said, how did you find me? And she said, well, obviously I haven't seen you for 60 years, but it occurred to me that you'd probably grown up to be trans. So I looked for a trans woman with your surname. And I said, why do you think that? She said, well, when we were 6, we were talking about it all the time. And I went, oh. And there was a whole complicated story about why we'd lost touch, which involved her mother pretending to the school that she died, which was the big trauma in my childhood, that my best friend suddenly died and disappeared. That's another story. But which is probably possibly part of why I suppressed all memory of the trans stuff till I was 12. So anyway, in my teens, being that sort of kid, no internet because it was the 60s. So I did the whole thing of reading up about sex and sexuality and read the Kinsey Report, read various Penguin specials on sex, read a lot, crucially read some gay fiction, trying to work out if I was gay. And I read John Retch's City of Night, which is famous gay hustler novel from the 60s.
When you say gay hustler, is that like gay sex worker?
Yeah. And there's a character in it who, obviously, given the date, is not necessarily portrayed as trans, but is clearly, as it were, pre-trans. There's a character, what they call a hair queen, called Miss Destiny. And I go, oh, that seems vaguely familiar. And so I went looking, I realized there was this thing called trans people, and I went and found some. And I was in Wakefield and Leeds, but there were trans people in Manchester, and I managed to find them by asking my local neighbourhood pub drag queen if she knew anyone.
In Leeds, and you ended up in Manchester?
Yeah, and she knew people in Manchester, so I went to Manchester and hung out with people in my teens.
Did you meet trans people then?
Yeah, there was a small group of trans women who were clustered around a proto-GIC in Manchester, most of whom got and had surgery and who were doing sex work. And I hung out with them and started going out on the town with them. I'm not the only person who hung out with those people. Shell Ross Turner also knew the same women, though we never met back then.
Oh, Michelle Ross, Clinic Q.
Clinic Q, Shell Ross Turner. Two elderly activists who both have the same background with, these role model street sex workers, and as I say, in the 60s. But Sylvia, who was my main mentor, was very insistent that I not drop out, that I do my A-levels, that I get myself to university and get a degree, because she said, you've got plenty of time to transition, and life is going to be a lot easier for you if you've got a bit of a background. It's going to be shit waiting to transition, but you've got the chance of going to Oxford. So you should do that and sort it, and you can come up here and hang out when it gets too much. And so that's what I did.
And so you went to Oxford around 66, 68?
68.
So it was just before then, 66, 67 is when you sort of discovered yourself and in politically and as a trans person.
Yeah, because I was also at the same time I was doing the Manchester stuff, I was very involved in the Young Liberals at the point when the Young Liberals were quite a radical group. I was very involved in a lot of sort of anarcho-pacifist stuff and was hanging out with, all sorts of people that subsequently had careers on more or less on the left, because I was here I was as a teenager, so, in the closet about being trans and about being queer, though actually, weirdly enough, some of the people I was hanging out with were also variously in closets, but we didn't know that at the time. On the Young Liberals National Committee and going to big Liberal Party meetings, it was all very glamorous. And that was the point at which, because some of my friends were in the Committee of 100, I started having my phone tapped, even though I wasn't in the Committee of 100.
Wait, who tapped your phone?
I don't know, but I know I have an MI5 file, because when I was a civil servant in the 70s, I got to see my personnel file and discovered on it a denunciation by one of the dons at my college, who reckoned I was some sort of subversive, which was on my civil service personnel file, CC'd from MI5.
That's wild and slightly disconcerting.
Yeah, well, I know, you go, okay, so that's a thing. Which, I mean, given that I've always been notoriously a soggy moderate from my standpoint. So anyway, Oxford, worked hard, didn't get the first I was expected to get, did graduate work,
What did you study?
English, and then I was doing a thesis on William Morris, but that fell through because some of my work got duplicated by another scholar, completely coincidentally, no plagiarism on either side, it was just bad luck.
Yeah.
And it was during that period, first of all, that I was travelling to London and being part of GLF, and I was also involved in the gay action group at Oxford. It was during that period that some of my feminist friends got very worried about the idea of me transitioning and did an intervention, which is one of the reasons why I didn't actually transition until much later in my 20s, because I got the serious talking to by a senior Marxist feminist who told me I'd got a false consciousness.
What was their angle on that?
Oh, you say you feel like, but what does that mean? What does that mean in class terms? What does that mean in terms of sexual oppression? You need to go away and think about this some more. I mean, in fairness to the woman involved, we worked together perfectly comfortably years later in the Feminists Against Censorship period, some 20 years later. Indeed, she was slightly in denial about its ever having happened, but I did decide that it might be less quote unquote selfish if I didn't try to transition and just tried to be a redeemed person. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why because I'd started on HRT, I was going around as Roz quite a lot in my last couple of years at Oxford, but I was scared. It was the early 70s. It wasn't the best time. I thought I'd wait and see, which insisted, which has its advantages, giving me more sympathy for people who detransition and people who eventually retransition, because I did. And I sort of continued to not be heavily active in queer politics, but I was hanging around the bars. I'd go to Pride, I'd go on demos.
Yeah, when did you get involved with the Gay Liberation Front?
That was before that period. It was 71. Basically, I'd done my finals. I was starting graduate work. I was having to go to London a lot to work in the British Library anyway. So I rang up GLF and said, I'm probably trans. Do you have a group? And they said, yes, we do.
The transvestite, transsexual, and drag queen group.
Yeah, that's right, which was run by Rachel Pollock, the amazing, with whom I'm still in touch, who was this amazing activist, come mystic, come science fiction writer, come expert on tarot, come stoner. I mean, when people ask me about the Don't Call Me Mr. You Fucking Beast manifesto, I have to point out that I don't actually remember working on it, but it's not really surprising because we were completely off our faces half the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask how that came about, but by the sounds of it, you're probably not going to be able to give me much of an answer.
I mean, we were asked to write a manifesto for Come Together. We wrote one. It was a collective effort, though I think from some of the turns of phrase, it was clearly mostly me and Rachel. As far as Rachel and I can remember, it was mostly us, but there was input from other people in the group.
Yeah, and I'll be sharing a link to that in the description, people listening, so you can read it for yourself. And it took me a while to find. Not going to lie, it's not the easiest thing, but then it's right there on the Bishopsgate Institute's website.
Yeah.
It's always in the last place you'd look, isn't it?
It is, and it's in the British Library. It's in the British Library's queer exhibit, along with an interview that Morgan Page did with me about it. We wanted to involve Rachel as well, but she was very ill at the time, but she's much better now. Yeah, so that was a thing. And I was coming down to London to be part of that group and going along to GLF plenaries a lot and going to Pride. And then a few months later, I had this existential crisis and desisted for a bit. In 73, I moved to Leeds and was very involved with Leeds GLF. which is interesting because the period just prior to the development of radical separatism in Leeds. So, I mean, I knew various of those people back before they were unpleasant.
We're talking Sheila Jeffries, Linda Bellos, that crowd.
I didn't know I knew a lot of, as it were, Sheila's then gang and the people who became angry women. I mean, including my flatmate with whom I stored some of my stuff when I moved to London in '74, and who subsequently, having seen the light, burned all my Marvel comics.
No.
Yeah.
That's horrible.
Yes.
As a massive Marvel fan, I find that very distressing.
Yeah, and you this is like a Marvel collection from the '60s through to the early '70s.
Yeah, we're talking proper Silver Age stuff.
Yeah.
Like, oh.
And my Silver Age Marvel collection was destroyed by radical feminism. Just saying.
That might be one of the worst things I've heard them do. So this whole period, like, you started off, I mean, I think a lot of people would be surprised to have found that you were part of a liberal group, considering what that term tends to refer to now.
Oh, yes. Remember, this is a liberal group that we were anarcho-pacifists. We're all the people that effectively got driven out of the Liberal Party in '71 when Jeremy Thorpe became leader. And a lot of us, quite a few of us, went off and became anarchists or Trotskyites, and I boringly joined the Labour Party. But I mean, this is why I know people like Hilary Wainwright from back then, and various people who got involved in NGOs. I mean, my best friend at school is Paul Cavadino, who spent his career involved with the National Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders. And another of my school debate team was Julian Filikowski, who spent his life doing overseas development stuff.
Sounds like you met everyone.
No, but I have this knack of knowing a lot of people. And I am casually acquainted with an awful lot of people. Including at least one serial killer, because I used to know Dennis Nielsen slightly, because he was the dishwasher in a cafe I used to eat in, and I occasionally talked to him. Where I'd hang out with the chef downstairs, which I sometimes did. I'd occasionally get into conversation with Dennis about opera, because he was a mad Wagnerite. And I'd see him around Soho, and I'd say, "Hi, Dennis," and he'd say, "Hi, Roz," and he was with young men, many of whom were never thereafter seen again.
Wow. So after all that came out, how did you feel about it?
Well, the classic story is I went to the cafe as normal, and Diana and Alf came and sat at my table, and I said, "You've heard about Dennis?" And I said, "Yes, I have." I said, "We want you to know we never let him anywhere near the meat pies."
I mean, that's just wisdom right there. That's wise.
Yeah, exactly. I'm spend 3 years trying to be a high-flying civil servant, staying in the closet, and it all gets too much. And I go and see my GP and say I want to transition.
This is around the mid-late 70s.
This is 76, 77. And about that time, I meet my friend Susanna, who's an American trans woman living over here and working. And we meet through casual acquaintances, and we start hanging out. And she says, obviously going to transition. What you should do, she said, what you should do is drop everything in London and come and stay with me in Chicago and transition there because this country is so awful. And so in 1978, I did, which didn't work out all that well because I had a huge row with Suze and I ended up having to live by my wits, i.e. hustle. And that was okay for a bit, but then I got raped by someone who burst into my room with fake police ID. And after that, I decided I'd had enough of Chicago, so I came back to London. Spent 6 months building up a cash reserve and then transitioned.
And did you transition in Chicago or did you transition once you got back?
I transitioned in Chicago, then detransitioned when I came back for 6 months just to accumulate some savings.
Right.
And continued to take HRT. And when I came back, I didn't socially transition until midsummer. I came back in early December. I then socially transitioned in London midway through the year. And then in 1980, I got this terribly apologetic phone call from Suze, and I went back to Chicago for a while, which was great, had a wonderful time. But then Suze fell foul of the mob, so we had to run back to London.
Like the mafia?
Yeah.
I mean, there were certain ways I thought that sentence was going to end, and that's not what I thought. Like, I feel like I shouldn't ask, but I kind of want to. Like, how does somebody get in trouble with the mob?
Well, her ex-boyfriend, she had this ex-boyfriend who'd been the trouble in the first place in 78, and they'd broken up, and he and his new girlfriend asked her to dinner and messed her up, and she trashed the place, and he called the police, and she proved that she paid for everything she'd smashed, because she kept receipts, bless her, and he was working at Gucci as a salesman, and his boss, Mr. Salvatore, had, as they say, connections. And so Mr. Salvatore quite fancied Stephen. So Stephen put out for Mr. Salvatore in order to get a hit on Susanna.
Okay, there's so many things I want to ask about that, but this is supposed to be about you. But I just want to say you've met some fascinating people.
So this ends up being the plot of my novel, which won the Lambda. Because 10 years after that, I realised I've got a great plot for a novel here.
I mean, yeah, and also it was around this time that you first put together Tiny Pieces of Skull.
Yeah, that's what Tiny Pieces of Skull is. That's the novel. I wrote that in the late 80s, about the period in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, back in London, I also end up, that's the period of the Dalston Commune, during the period between 79 and 80, when I'm actually in London before I go back to Chicago, is because I was friends with a bunch of slightly younger trans kids who were hustling in Soho, hustling and working in clip joints. I got a conservatorship from a housing association, one of those things where you have a licensed squat. You just have to be prepared to move on to a different licensed squat at quite short notice. So I was doing that in Hackney originally, because I inherited it from a friend. And then we moved lock, stock and barrel to Dalston. Basically, I ended up with a house full of Soho trans kids, making sure they saved money for their surgery and didn't do drugs and being bossy.
So what was life like for you and them then? Like,
well, read The Great Good Time, which is my collection of poems about that period. Because having done Tiny Pieces of Skull as a novel, I did the Dalston period as a poetry collection last year. As they always say, it's the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was scary. It was the start of the Thatcher period. It was the winter of discontent prior to that. You could be arrested by the police for walking while trans, on the assumption that even if you weren't doing sex work, that you were doing sex work. And there were a couple of Soho cops who had a particular, thing about us. And it was quite handy that I was I could. I mean, remember, my ludicrous poshness is a complete pretense. I'm actually trash, but I'm just quite good at being pseudo posh. And part of my job in all of that period was talking myself and other people out of messes by just being incredibly posh at the cops.
and that worked?
Yeah, to a surprising extent.
I mean that's probably good advice for people listening.
Yeah, I mean, when you're doing voice trains, it helps to just fake your background a little. I'm a kid from Yorkshire, for fuck's sake. But I made the decision at Oxford that various people had made before me, that it was, go native.
So how did you get involved with the chain reaction?
So what then happens in sort of like 82 is I have my surgery, and there were a lot of complications with my surgery. Won't go into details, but all quite unpleasant for a couple of years. And so I'm pretty much out of action for anything except work and reviewing and feeling sorry for myself. So after all that, in sort of like 84, 85, I wake up one fine morning and realise that I'm no longer particularly attracted to guys. I mean, I'd been sort of mostly sleeping with guys in my teens and 20s. I had a quite intense affair with my closest woman friend, who was more or less doing the whole, how do you know you're not? Why don't you try? And it was fine. And we were really good friends, and it was all a laugh, but it wasn't working out for me. But I decided that since I was probably going to be a dyke from now on, and that probably meant I wasn't going to get laid very much because transphobia, I started being a volunteer at the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, working the desk at the front. And that meant I got involved in all the rows at the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, the so-called London sex wars. Now, you may not know about this, but there was an attempt in the days of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre to bar overt signs of people being into kink and overt signs of bisexuality. It wasn't that people were being barred in person, but it was, you can come to the Lesbian and Gay Centre if you're a leatherite, but you mustn't wear your leathers because they're oppressive, because I feel oppressed by them, because I'm Linda Bellos and Sheila Jeffries. And a group of us got together and decided, and my position on this originally was, amazingly, they're not coming after trans people. That's because most trans people are staying well away. But they will come after trans people. So solidarity dictates I get involved. And a group of us formed Sexual Fringe, which was a ginger group to help organise the fight back against the Jeffries Bellos crowd, trying to keep people they didn't like out of the Lesbian and Gay Centre. And there were a number of public debates, and we won. Now, as a result of that, I got to know a lot of the lesbian SM crowd, and indeed slept with a couple of them. And I mean, the point is, my attitude on kink was, I wasn't kink averse. It was part of my sexual repertoire because a couple of boyfriends I'd had in the past. It was something I could take or leave alone, frankly. But then chain reaction happened, because basically the lesbian SM scene in London had gone into the doldrums in the aftermath of winning this great victory, because people had big fallings out over one thing and another. And then a bunch of Finnish women and East German women came to London looking for the good time they'd heard about, and it wasn't there anymore, so they recreated it, which was how Chain Reaction started, which was a lesbian SM disco, and I ended up being part of the collective for a couple of years.
That became the subject of the film Rebel Dykes that came out in 2021.
Yes.
Heartily recommend it. I watched it last night. For people listening, it is really good. You learn a lot, and also what surprised me was how much a lot of things haven't changed when it comes to the community. Like there's still, like, it's like there was a tradition that was almost invented there that has kind of carried on to this day. And the battles between those who seem to be more gatekeepy in general against those who are all about tearing those gates down. There seems to be these same battles going on to this day.
Well, there is a continuity, and there's always been a continuity. I mean, which is why some of the same people are involved on both sides. I mean, because there are people still involved, like me and Lisa Power, who was not part of the Chain Reaction crowd, but was a good ally, and is a good ally now. And these battles continue, except that, weirdly enough, there was a period in the 90s when I found myself working positively with Linda Bellos on racial stuff.
This was when you were with Liberty.
Yeah.
You started doing things with the National Council for Civil Liberties, and then you went on to be the Deputy Chair of Liberty.
Yeah.
What was that like, working with Linda Bellos? For people who don't know who are listening, Linda Bellos, she doesn't seem to be that active these days. I haven't heard that much from her, but she's gone
very quiet. But the thing is, what you need to remember about Linda is that, among other things, she was very involved with the reparations movement. And Liberty celebrated its 60th anniversary. Liberty held a huge conference in 96, I think. And I was organising one stream of that conference. But I discovered that someone had put together a discussion of the reparations movement, which was all white men.
That's an interesting choice that they made there.
And because I was deputy chair, I was in a position to say, bloody hell, that can't stand. And very embarrassedly, I went on hands and knees to Linda and said, look, you're quite entitled to tell us all to fuck off, but this is happening, and it's a chance to put the real case of the reparations movement in a public forum, and I'm really embarrassed to have to ask you to come and be on a thing that was originally white men. And she said, yeah. And it was quite good, actually, working with her on something where our other issues just didn't occur, because she knew perfectly well who I was and that I'd been a complete thorn in her and Sheila's side over the sex wars. But she was also quite impressed that I had no problem working with her on something else, because Linda, I mean, I think I've always thought it's tragic that Linda's always been involved with those politics, because in lots of respects, she's got great politics. And in lots of respects, she hasn't got great politics. I mean, Linda's record is very checkered. But there are some areas where she's terrific.
Yeah, I'm seeing all the way through like the 70s and 80s and today, like the sex wars you described them, just so people listening who may not be aware understand what we're talking about. There was like two rough sections of the lesbian movement and the feminist movement. One was very much liberate, be yourself, kink, all of that stuff, and the other side was very much that stuff is oppressive, that stuff is coming from men. Do you have a man in your brain? That kind of thing. Is that about right?
That's about right. But it's also to do with one of the problems with all of that crowd is that they think that it is possible in politics to have an absolute crushing forever victory. And that's probably not how life works. I mean, having done sex work and actually been sexually abused while doing sex work, I am well aware of the problems. But as I always say, harm reduction is not harm denial. The important thing is to keep people as safe as you can possibly keep them. And abolitionism does not make women safe, because abolitionism, apart from anything else, depends on the cops. And you cannot trust the cops to not exploit the situation.
Yeah, countries that have taken on the Nordic model have kind of had that, what you just said, be kind of proven out over time.
And in fact, if you make things illegal, you put things into the hands of actual serious criminals. I mean, again, one of the problems is that actual criminals love abolitionists. When angry women were burning down pawn shops in Leeds, the pawn barons actually bought places and insured them heavily, knowing that there was a chance they'd be burned down.
There's always an angle, isn't there? There's always an angle.
There's always an angle. And one of the problems with the whole SWERFs and TERFs is that they are often quite naive, both about the political people they end up working with and the other elements they end up empowering.
And I think that bears out to when Linda Bellos travelled to America and stood on an Alliance Defending Freedom platform outside the Supreme Court, arguing against a Supreme Court case that eventually led on to legal discrimination protections for LGBT people in work.
Yeah, because it happened that the case was primarily a trans case.
Yeah. People can't see, but I've got my head in my hands right now.
I haven't been in touch with Linda for some years, because it's that whole thing where when someone publicly insults me,
You're done.
I'm done.
I mean, that's fair enough.
And when someone publicly insults me, not as a matter of principle, but because she's chivied into it, which is what happened, because she'd referred to me as she and everyone shouted at her.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I guess all of this stuff kind of led into you co-founding the Feminists Against Censorship Network in 1989.
Well, the Feminists Against Censorship stuff was like, I had, as it were, personal and artistic differences with some of the Shame Reaction mob, and dropped out of the collective, though continued to go to the club and hang out with a lot of the same people. And so I needed something to occupy my time. It was around that time that Liberty, in which I wasn't yet on the executive, adopted Dworkin-McKinnon policy on pornography. And the opposition to that was mostly coming from rather tedious male libertarians. And a bunch of us thought, there is a feminist case for freedom of expression, for freedom even of sexual expression, which doesn't mean condoning the abuses within the porn industry. It means actually critiquing that, but critiquing it from making the lives of workers in that part of the sex industry safer and better, instead of making them worse through abolitionism. And so we came together to make that case. A lot of the old socialist feminist mob, but I ended up being one of the organisers of the Feminists Against Censorship, simply because I knew a lot of the relevant people and I'm quite competent at creating networks. And also because I realised, both in terms of my own position as a trans woman and also the organisation, that the real thing to do was not try and be front and centre, but actually organise meetings and do the minutes, because that's where the real power lies. No.
That's how you get the stuff done.
Yeah, it's how to ensure stuff gets done. And so that's what I did for a couple of years in the early days of Feminists Against Censorship. I basically helped organise meetings and did the minutes and chivied people into speaking, but inevitably I did some speaking. I tried not to very much, but that's part of the story of how I ended up on the Liberty Executive, because we also realised it wasn't enough to win debates at the annual general meeting. We had to embed ourselves in the organisation. This is what the other side refer to as institutional capture. And may I say, institutional capture is jolly hard work. And one of the reasons why, in general terms, what the other side call liberal feminism has been quite successful is because people are prepared to put in what the Germans call Sitzfleisch. Sitting your bum in meetings for hours and boring hours. It's not glamorous. No, and I mean, this was a period when various Labour MPs were pushing a Dworkin-McKinnon-style ordinance, and we produced a very detailed analysis of what was wrong with the specifics of the law that they were proposing.
What was the law they were proposing?
The Dawn Primarolo bill, which was basically to create a category of shops which would be licensed for the sale of pornography but couldn't sell anything else, and only they could sell it.
Right, okay.
And one of the problems with this is that if a cop disliked Ulysses, the novel by James Joyce, and felt it was pornography, as some of it could be held to be, they could shut down Foyles for selling it.
So they really didn't think this through at all.
They didn't think it through at all. It was a very bad piece of legal drafting, and various people said, but if you tell them what's wrong with it, they might improve it. I said, well, worst case, if it's not as bad, it's not as bad. But
it's bad from the ground up. It's a terrible idea from the start.
Yeah, let's because basically it was handing censorship over to council officials and the police, trading standards officers and the police to decide what was pornography and what was not.
Yeah, and the police today are kind of going through a thing where they're shall we say backwards views held by an alarming amount of police officers. They're going through a moment about that now. I can imagine what the average cop's views were 30 years ago.
This was a period when the Soho Vice Squad was being run by a man who was an evangelical Christian.
Ah, there it is.
This is the period when the police busted a couple of bookshops for a magazine. There's a rather poncy arts magazine called Research, capital R, capital S, which has issues on things like J.G. Ballard and William Burroughs, but they've done one issue on modern primitives, which was about scarification, piercing, and tattooing. And it was on sale at the ICA. It was also on sale at a couple of Soho bookstores that had some porn in them. And they busted a shop for selling modern primitives, which was on sale, as I say, at the ICA. I was the observer at the case. I was the Liberty observer at the trial. And it was before a stipendiary magistrate rather than just an ordinary beak. And he, bless him, came to the conclusion, the law talks about depraving and corrupting. Anyone who'd get off on this stuff is obviously already depraved and corrupted.
Sounds like a lot has changed for the better over the last, decade with a lot of that stuff. Kinky stuff, sexual stuff in general has been...
He acquitted it on the grounds that you can't corrupt someone who's already corrupted.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Because it was things like there was an article on those penile modifications that some native Australians do. He said if anyone can get off of that, they are already depressed.
That is such legal logic.
It's glorious. So, I mean, that was that period. And it was a matter of treating the other side with probably more respect than they deserved. But actually, the anti-pornography people of that time were slightly inclined to accuse us of taking money from the mob. And we were saying, no, we don't. They said, why have you got such good letterhead then? And we'd say, because some of us are professional designers. We give our work for free as opposed to spending money we've raised from who knows who on fancy consultants. Well, the thing is, Feminists Against Censorship was always an absolutely threadbare organisation financially, but we were good at what we did. Yeah, like I say, we had good letterhead. Kate Charlesworth designed our logo for us. That was interesting. It was just proof that you can do these things with quite. I mean, I was pressed for change that Sheila and that Christine and Stephen were doing at the same time was very effective. Absolutely no money, but managed to get laws passed.
Yeah, that leads nicely into your involvement with, at first, the Parliamentary Forum on the Gender Recognition Act. and subsequently as like you just told me before we started recording, the Equality Act itself. Like you were like, how does someone get involved in that? Does someone just send you a letter and ask you? Like, what happened?
Well, the thing is, Parliamentary Forum was using, or as well as being involved with Liberty, I was involved with a small group called the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, which was centered around a zine called Sexual Deviance. That was because I met Kate Moore and some of the other people and liked them and started going to their meetings. And basically, I became the GNSA delegate to the Parliamentary Forum, is what happened. It was a bit of a bodge. It was a way of, by 99, I was pretty much done with Liberty. I'd lost out. I'd only stuck around to defend a couple of various people's jobs and the staff who were being railroaded out of the organisation. And I'd stayed involved. They changed the constitution to stop me being, so we only had one deputy chair in order to get rid of me. But then in 99, I got very ill and had to reconsider everything. So by the time the Parliamentary Forum was seriously working on the GRA, I was no longer part of Liberty, but was technically there as the NSA delegate. And it also, going on to occasional meetings of the Parliamentary Forum, was what my health would stand. So that's how come I got involved. And it was very much Zoe Jane Clayton and I were there representing queer trans people, primarily. I mean, Christine would now identify as much queerer than she would have then.
So who else was there?
Oh God, bunch of people from civil service groups. I mean, like Aegis. But I mean, it was things like one of the crucial fights was various people in the cabinet. We don't know who, but we think we know who, but we don't know, so can't say. Were pushing for part of gender recognition to be a requirement of sterilisation. That was then the case in a number of European countries.
Yeah.
And Stephen and I wrote a paper on how basically this was eugenics, and it's cropping up in various. These were all countries which had a very dodgy tradition with eugenics, like Sweden. And it happened that both Stephen and I knew an awful lot about the subject. Stephen, because he studied in a couple of legal cases, me, because back in my civil service period, I'd actually had to do a brief for ministers about sterilisation of mentally handicapped people and why we didn't do it. And so I actually I'd done a lot of research and had a lot of expertise. So we were in a position to produce a really good paper on why this was a really bad idea.
What was the justification, do you think, for including a sterilisation clause or something in it?
Oh, well, basically to be in step with other countries.
That's so strange. It's like nobody, at no point did they think maybe it's not a good idea. Like, it just feels so obvious to me sat here in 2023 and finding it very hard to figure out how over 20 years ago, someone could have thought that was a good idea. But that's how time works, isn't it? That's just what people are.
I mean, and the point is, those European countries that were doing that back then, often demanding sterilisation for any kind of illegal weapon, have all backtracked on it. And I think there are a couple of European countries that are still sterilising trans people and have upgraded that to insisting on the destruction of any stored genetic material. In case you were wondering why this could possibly be eugenics.
Yeah, it would be eugenics, but it wouldn't even work. Like, being trans doesn't run in families like that.
Well, maybe it does, they thought. We'd better make sure.
My God. I'm laughing, but it's horrible. I'm laughing because it's so horrible. That sounds like a fight that you won, though, looking at how the Gender Recognition Act shook out in the end.
Yeah, well, it wasn't that much. It was one of the things we did. But we're talking the build-up, we're talking the GRA. I was always very unhappy with the GRA we got because it didn't recognise non-binary people. It had that, and it had that whole rigmarole of the panel. Which is one of the reasons why I never got my GRC till a couple of years ago, because tedious privilege principle. Because I felt I've inflicted this on people by being part of the Parliamentary Forum, and I'm not prepared to take advantage of something that I don't entirely approve of. But then with the pandemic, I decided to exploit the fact they'd actually lowered the fee and sorted it out. because I'd been principal for 15 years or so.
Yeah.
I'd made the point.
So there were calls for non-binary people to be recognised that back then.
Yeah, well, back in the period at Liberty, one of the things I did was be involved in a lot of submissions that Liberty was making to the UN on various issues, including sex and gender stuff. And what actually happened, this is actually quite amusing. What actually happened is that one of my colleagues had got the idea, had heard the word transgender and thought, oh, this is obviously the new correct locution. And he thought of it as synonymous with transsexual rather than a useful umbrella, and altered all the documents to say transgender, and then came and asked me about it. And I said, well, strictly speaking, that's possibly not what you meant, but it's a good thing to have done for the following reason. We need to depathologize identities. People's civil liberties and civil rights should not be dependent on a medical diagnosis. There are people who, for a variety of reasons, including pre-existing health conditions, can't medically transition or can't fully medically transition. There are a lot of other people who just don't quite identify with that live their lives in a way that's largely commensurate with the umbrella. One of the reasons this happened was that in 1991, I'd met Kate Bronstein. So I read Sexual Outlaw before it came out.
For people who don't know, Kate Bronstein is a non-binary trans person in the States, kind of a legend there. And here, just so you know how much of a big deal Kate is, the one time I talked to them online, I was freaking out for about 3 days. Because, yeah, Kate's the best. But sorry, continue, yeah.
My line on, I didn't identify personally with what Kate was saying for myself, but I could perfectly well see it applying to all sorts of people. And they have a right, they had a right to the protection of the law as well. And so I basically then went to Liberty AGM and retroactively changed Liberty's policy so that the documents that had been put through with transgender in reflected what Liberty's policy now was. It was at this point that Press for Change came to Liberty and suggested some quite minor tinkerings with Liberty's previous policy to make it more trans inclusive. And I had to say to Christine Stephen, you didn't bother checking what Liberty's policy now is, because actually what they were proposing was less radical than I'd already got through, which was amusing. I was probably a bit arrogant at them about that, because one of my besetting sins is arrogance. But I worked together well with them afterwards, so that's all.
Yeah,
right.
we did. We've done a couple of episodes on Press for Change. It was supposed to be one, but it turned out there was so much that they'd done, it turned into two very quickly.
Such a great group, but it was all going on, but I was committed to working with Liberty, and there were a whole load of battles I was fighting within Liberty, because this was that period leading up to the 97 election when a lot of NGOs were under total pressure to get in line with the Blair mission, and there was a lot of pressure from funding organisations like Roundtrees to toe the line. And this is part of the true and terrible story of why I ended up not becoming chair of Liberty.
Sounds like you probably would have been nice if you did, but it sounds like you've done a bit of everything. You started off in Leeds, went to Manchester, met other trans people, did Oxford, were part of all sorts of grassroots efforts, and then ended up in lobbying, essentially.
Yeah, and all of this in my spare time from...
Yeah, because your main thing, which we haven't even touched on that much really, is that you're a writer, poet, critic of renown. That's a whole other part of your life we haven't even touched on yet. I read up in my research that you, due to a flatmate you lived with, you decided not to do poetry in your early 20s.
Yeah.
I didn't start again until your 50s. What happened there?
Basically, what happened was that, I wrote a lot of poetry at Oxford. It wasn't very good, and I was sharing a flat with a couple of people who were considerably more talented, considerably more talented than me. One of whom didn't have a career in that because he went off to become some kind of guru, but that's another story. Christopher Reid, who was the poetry editor at Favour for years and is one of the best living English poets, Mayor. And I was abashed. But also, I kind of because I knew I was in the closet about being trans and was messed up about it and not sure about who I was or what, I kind of didn't trust my use of language. And then what happened in my late 50s was that a poet friend died suddenly and tragically, a man called Mike Ford, John M. Ford, science fiction writer and poet. And I organised a memorial meeting in London, and I wrote my first poem in 30 odd years about Mike's death and posted it because it was some sort of tribute to him. And people said, "We didn't know you were a poet." I said, "I'm not. I just wrote this poem." And people said, "Yes, you are." And so I started thinking of myself as possibly writing poetry again. And around that time, there was this whole row about the anniversary of the Stonewall riot going on, where a lot of respectable gay men in the States were trying to diminish the trans contribution to the Stonewall riot. And trans historians like Susan Stryker were reinstating it. And this was all to do with the exclusion of trans people from the Employment Non-Discrimination Act that they were trying to get through Congress. And a lot of people felt if trans people are in, it will fail, whereas we can get employment non-discrimination for lesbians and gay men and maybe bis, but probably not those trans people. And so there was this whole argument, trans people weren't involved in Stonewall, so trans people can wait their turn. And we said, bullshit, bullshit, was one of the reasons why Susan rediscovered the Compton cafeteria riot to prove that trans people were actually, even before years before Stonewall, on the streets demonstrating against discrimination, before as early as any gay and lesbian groups were. I decided that what we needed was a poem. So I thought we needed a barnstorming political poem about the Stonewall riots. So I wrote one, and it hit a bit of a nerve, and I got to do it in public a lot, and still occasionally do. And that kind of, I really can do this. So I started writing poetry all the time. There's a lot still that hasn't been published.
But there is a collection out there.
Oh yeah, there are 5 collections.
5?
Yeah, there's the 2 original, 6 actually. There's a chapbook called The Abigail Sonnets, which is about my dead friend. There's the 2 from Midsummer Night's Press, Dialectic of the Flesh, which is mostly trans-related stuff and sex-related stuff, and What If What's Imagined Were All True, which is about fantasy and mythology. There's my translations of the Roman poet Catullus, some English versions. There's the ballads, which are my strange little narrative poems set in the 18th century about doomed stroppy women. There's the big selected poems that are out before us, and since then there's another chapbook, The Great Good Time, which is my poetic memoir of trans life in the late 70s. That's quite a lot of collections of poetry.
Yeah, in my research I only tracked down one of them. Either I failed or the literary industry has failed you. I'm not sure which. It's probably me. It's almost certainly me.
But I mean, Catullus has got serious reviews. I mean, like from actual classicists. I mean, the Catullus translation actually got blurbed by Mary Beard.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
So your whole life has been... It's like at certain points you've had to pause certain things. You had to pause your transition at different times. Well, you didn't have to, but you kind of felt like you had to. And you've put pause to... like your poetry, but then all the way through at the same time, you were there for some pretty seminal moments in queer history. Like, that's a hell of a life, Roz. Well done.
Well, I mean, most people, I mean, I always say, I don't think I'm special. I've had a lot of good luck and a lot of bad luck, and the combination of the two just makes me interesting. It's a matter of going with the flow. I always wanted to write a gigantic fantasy novel. I wasn't ready to write it till I was 60. And now, as of late spring this year, I will have written 2/3 words of it. I meant to write the trans novel, and Tiny Pieces of Skull is a good stab at the trans novel. The next novel, if I manage to write it, will be about being trans life in the 80s, because I haven't written about trans life in the 80s. I want to write at some point a novel about being trans and old, because being trans and old is something that happens to everyone sooner or later, if we're lucky. And I do think that the trans community needs to actually think more about its elders. As I've become by default an older trans person, I'm rather more aware of how little I thought about that issue when I was younger, mostly because, frankly, we mostly assume we won't make it that long. And I do worry, particularly given the way that the medical profession in the 70s and 80s put this huge stress on stealth. I do worry about the trans elders who are out there without support, without any community or support, because they went stealth and disconnected from the community and possibly need help, particularly in an era of massive transphobia.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't usually come up that much. Like, what the trans is a thing, our audience tends to skew younger. And that's probably, us being an online thing, is probably part of that. But we rarely hear from people who are, like, over 50. Like, rarely.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's a whole bunch of older trans people still doing stuff. I mean, Christine is mostly doing environmentalist stuff now. Stephen's had a lot of health problems, but those two are iconic. Those two did so much for the community and should perpetually be acknowledged. I mean, I've dipped in and out by comparison. But I mean, it's older trans entertainers like Adele Anderson, who is awesome. I mean, who obviously I've known since GLF. We don't pay enough respect to Rachel.
Rachel Pollock.
Yeah, started the GLF group. But I mean, people do acknowledge her in the States, which is where she mostly is. I mean, I'm amazed at the extent to which people don't talk about Kate as much as they used to.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, I first found Kate Bernstein in 2013 when I went to Gay is the Word. I'd just come out a year before, and I didn't know anyone. I didn't get involved in the trans community until 2 years after I came out. But at that point, this was my first time going to anything queer, really. And I was like, and somebody saw me in the shop and came up and was like, "Are you okay?" Like, he could sense something was up, and I was just like, clearly I'm new. I don't know what I'm doing. Is there a book that can help me? And he handed me Kate Bernstein's book, Hello Cruel World, and was like, "You need this." And I read that book from cover to cover about 7 or 8 times within a year. And at that time so Kate Bernstein was like my route in to queer anything, really. And I looked online and there was loads of stuff about them. And then when I finally talked to them online on Twitter, it was just like, this is such a big moment for me. But you're right, people used to talk about Kate all the time, and you don't really hear as much now. That's a crime. Everyone listening, go out and get everything Kate has ever done. And go out and get everything that Roz has ever done.
I do worry that, I mean, one of the things that worries me is the divisions in the community. I do worry, I've been very snarky about some of the trans medicalists down the years, but they are still part of the community, even if they don't necessarily all want to be. On paper, I should be a trans medicalist because I had surgery, I did the whole surgery route, but I also always had friends who weren't going that route for various reasons, and they were still part of the same community. And that's the thing. I mean, we're never going to be all in the same place at the same time. I mean, I worry that maybe we need to cool it on public counter-protest, because I'm not sure that will remain safe, because there are crazy people out there, and I'm hearing stuff about 3D printed machine guns being out there in the right wing, and with rifled barrels being smuggled into the country's wind chimes.
Yeah, I was saying that back in the 70s and 80s, would that kind of thing have stopped you then?
Not stopped me, but I might have actually thought, let's invest heavily in Kevlar. There is nothing shameful about running away.
Yeah.
I have been on demonstrations where we were charged by police forces. I know when to run.
Yeah.
Minus strike.
As you will be well aware, and anybody who is trans, non-binary who's been listening will be very aware, there's been a certain level of moral panic about trans people over the last few years. Don't know if you've noticed, Roz, but that's a thing.
Oh, you think?
Considering you've lived through several of those already, what makes this one different, and what makes this one similar to others you've been through?
Well, I mean, the obvious parallel was a lot of the stuff that happened in the HIV epidemic, where people were talking about branding people on the forehead, where people were talking about isolation camps, where on our side, people were talking about a general strike of trans people, of all LGBT people, talk about moral panic, television ads with black and white icebergs. There is a crisis. Similarly, Sunak's playing by the Thatcher rule book. I mean, he's denouncing trans people Thatcher saying people are telling children that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
Rishi Sunak just did that on Piers Morgan's show like a day ago at time of recording.
Yeah, exactly. And that was in the days when Thatcher was pretty unassailable, as opposed to now when Sunak is clearly in trouble, not just with the electorate, with his own party. I mean, Sunak's rather stupidly trying to cash in on the moral panic as a diversion from the fact that half of his cabinet are crooks and loons. We've had the Zahawi crisis, we're about to have the Raab crisis, and no one's dealing with the 200 missing asylum seeker children.
And on top of that, there's a brewing Liz Truss crisis coming. Like, that seems to be something on the way.
And indeed, Boris Johnson has not gone away.
Scam seems a bit fucked, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean...
it makes it very understandable why he's turning on us at the moment.
Desperately to drag us into it. But obviously, the real issue is that the Murdoch press have really invested very heavily in anti-trans panic. I mean, I assume because Rupert's decided he dislikes us. I don't know why. I think just because he thinks it's a way to make his people win. The Times has been obsessed for 5 years now, which is pretty insane. I mean, it's worrying. I am worried. I'm more worried about stuff in the States. I mean, did you watch that Trump video?
I mean, he was just calling for an end of trans people. Like, that's what that was. That's not hyperbole.
But also, he was saying trans people are a conspiracy by Big Pharma.
Yeah.
Which is, let's face it, one step away from an anti-Semitic dog whistle.
Yeah, it's like a while ago there was a mass shooting in America, and there was stuff going on online. Trans people were saying that like his manifesto was about trans people, and I was like, I'll have to take a look now. 300 pages. We were only half a page, but it was full of that stuff. It was full of that stuff that like trans people are a plot by Jewish people to destabilize society. Like, that was the half page on us in this 300-page manifesto of the weirdest, most horrible things I've ever read in my life. And presidential candidate just says that on television, and everyone's just like, that's fine. Like, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah. Given that in the 2019 election, anti-Semitism was an incredibly big issue. And one of the weird things is people seem not to mind anti-Semitism when it's associated with transphobia.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the person saying it. Either the person saying it just hates trans people so much they don't mind and will let the anti-Semitism go, or maybe the anti-Semitism's the point. I guess it depends on who's saying it.
Well, I mean, you've got this movement that's so intensely contaminated by anti-Semitism, and yet even the Jewish Chronicle is pushing out transphobic stuff. You go, guys, get a grip. It's very worrying how people celebs get caught up in transphobia and instantly their work goes to shit.
Oh, that's so true.
It
goes down to another level as well, because what I've noticed is that like anti-trans podcasts, their sound quality is awful. And as a podcaster person myself, that offends me more a lot of the time than what they're saying. It's just like noise reduction. It's free on Audacity. It takes 2 seconds and like a quick Google to figure it out. They have no production values, these fucking people.
I mean, obviously, I'm sure I'm not alone in this. People that I know and used to care about have disappeared into this cult. And not just turfery, but the tradwife movement or overt fascism. And that transphobia was kind of the gateway drug to really bad politics.
The former comedy writer pathway, as a lot of people are seeing.
Well, yeah, it's not just, it's people that you never have thought would go that way. I mean, good comrades, people that I knew socially that were fun. I mean, no names, no Pactrial, no libel suits, but people that were like bouncing around London, being androgynous and sleeping with trans guys and sleeping with lesbians and suddenly writing books on reactionary feminism and tradwifery. And what happened to...
Saying that, do you have any hope for the trans community going forward?
I mean, we are amazingly resilient. We are tempered like steel. I'm not saying it's going to be a tough few years, but people, we are tough as anything when it comes down to it. We have to be. And some of us will not make it through, and that's tragic, but we will survive. I have survived some quite bad times, and it just made me better. You want to know why I stopped writing for years? Well, It's partly because I wasn't ready. And one of the things that made me ready was going through a lot of shitty times. And some of my best writing was about bad times, which are also good times because solidarity and, the pure love of siblings will get through. I mean, we will get through.
Whatever choice is there. That's probably a good place to wrap things up, Roz. Thank you so much for this chat.
No problem.
So that was Roz Kaveney, and that was a pretty damn good interview. Well done.
I didn't do much.
Well, sometimes you don't need to. You just need to ask the right question and away you go, kind of thing.
Yeah, but, like, she was raring to go. Like, usually at the beginning of interviews, I'm like, hey, thanks for coming. No, she's straight in there, just like, right, here we go.
Yeah.
And I always love doing interviews with, like, older trans people who have been around the block, because I get this feeling that, like, I'm part of a tradition
right
that has been stretching back. Like, not to say that I'm anywhere near on the level of Roz in any way, shape, or form, but it's just there is a history and also a lot of similar issues other generations have faced and proved triumphant. So there is something hopeful about talking to people like Roz, and I like to do more interviews of people like from her generation, like Stephen Whittle and Michelle Ross and other people. So if you happen to be listening, older trans people, you can get us through. You could contact us through our website if you want to come on for a chat.
Yes,
You
indeed.
can come to whatthetrans.com, or you can reach us on Twitter, whatthetrans, Facebook, whatthetrans, Mastodon, journo.host/whatthetrans. That's a newish one we're trying to get off the ground because, social media is in danger from a weirdo called Elon Musk. We also have a Patreon. So, if you like what you heard and want to give us money every month, do it.
Yeah.
If you don't, then don't. Fine. But if you do, go to patreon.com/whatthetrans.
All right, yeah. I think I will. Oh, wait, no, I don't need to, do I? But yes, please do check out our other stuff, our social media presence. Give us a like, share, subscribe. Thank you very much for listening. And we will see you again soon. Goodbye.
See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
This episode of What the Trans was written and produced by Ashley Talbot and Michelle Snow, and was edited by Ben Swithin and Michelle Snow. And we'd also very much like to thank our producer-level Patreons, who are Jenny,
Break the System,
Sian Phillips,
Heidi Reardon,
Ezra,
Sophia the Sixth,
Lentil,
Philippa Taprog,
Ramona Martinez,
Alethea Aurora,
Sadie,
Claire Viliami,
Amelia,
Kyra the Asexual Turfbuster and her trusty sidekick Jiggly Jobs,
Zeph,
Fiona McDonald,
Torikuso H,
Murgatroyd,
Claire Renshaw,
Ontologically Unjust,
Stella,
Cindergosa,
Rebecca Prentice,
Crazy Richard,
Dan Oblivion,
Georgina Young,
Ty Griffiths,
Florence Stanley,
Riley,
Helen.
Chrissy Jarvis,
A dyslexic velociraptor is overjoyed at the resurrection of the Spookmaster General.
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Melody Nix,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn McKay,
Nick Duffy,
C.B. Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Wen Riverick,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Patreon user,
Vic Kelly,
Sarah Bedford of Dogs,
Emma Doyle,
Catherine,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Cumber,
Karakan 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanos.
and Chris Hubley. Thanks for listening. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.